Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Before I start today's episode, I want to ask the listeners to consider going to catholicculture.org and sign up for one of our newsletters. You may or may not know that this podcast is a production of catholicculture.org, a website that has a lot more resources than just podcasts. We are actually in our 20th year right now. And so we have, well before the podcast era sort of began. And we've got all kinds of articles, commentary, news, a big library of Catholic documents, including works by the Church Fathers, papal encyclicals, all sorts of great stuff. So if you want to keep up with everything that we've got going on at Catholic Culture beyond just the podcast, I would go to catholicculture.org/newsletter and access all the resources. I didn't mention we also have information for every day of the liturgical year, Catholic traditions, recipes, all kinds of stuff that you can access there as well. All right, so on to today's interview. My guest today, returning after a relatively recent appearance, is Holly Ordway, who is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at Word on Fire, and she's the visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. She's the author of a number of books, including the award-winning Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, and As Kingfishers Catch Fire, selected and annotated poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins, which is, I've had her on the show to talk about both of those. And today we're on to talk about her latest book, also from Word on Fire, Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography. This is really excellent, thorough, very engaging, new scholarly biography of Tolkien that I would say even if you're just a casual fan of Tolkien, I think you'll find it very interesting because you learn so much not only about a man who had a very interesting life, but about what it was like to be a Catholic in England at the time that he lived. So a lot of fascinating stuff in here. Very happy to have Holly on. Welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be back.
Okay, well, I want to dive right into the deep end here with a question, and let's get your honest take on this, regardless of who it may or may not upset. Do you think Tolkien should be canonized?
Well, that's a good question, and it depends what you mean by should. You are asking an English professor who's going to look at the nuances of language, because there are a couple of questions here. One is whether do I personally think that he is currently enjoying the beatific vision?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, yes, I do. And as it happens, I have Tolkien in my own personal litany of saints whom I ask for intercessions. So I think he's amongst the saints. That's my personal sense of it, especially after doing all the research into his life. I do think that although he was certainly a flawed man, he would have been absolutely the first to acknowledge that he was far from perfect. I think he did show a life of heroic virtue. And as I said, I think that he is enjoying the beatific vision right now. Do I think that it's necessarily the best move to start up a cause for his canonization right now? Possibly not, because, right now, a lot of people, especially in the broader world, really don't understand what a saint is. They don't understand what the process of canonization means. And whenever this topic comes up in the wider Tolkien community, it upsets a lot of people because they think incorrectly that it means that we are saying he was totally perfect in every way, that we're putting him on a pedestal. Perhaps they're thinking that we're worshiping or there's idolatry involved. But even apart from that mistake, this idea that somehow we are making him into a perfect, like claiming he was perfect. Well, that's not what canonization is about. But it causes a lot of confusion. And I think that right now, a push for the cause of canonization could perhaps hinder some people from encountering his writings who might otherwise, encounter him. Someone who is, skeptical about the church might be put off by the fact, the church is holding him up as if he's this, this perfect guy, and they're idolizing him, and no, thank you, I don't want anything to do with that sort of hyper piety. And so I think it's not really necessarily the moment. Particularly, I would also say, particularly since we who love Tolkien and are Catholics need to ask ourselves the question: are we maybe thinking about canonization because we really do think that he is in the presence of God and is going to be a great intercessor for us and deserves, will help us to be formally canonized? Or is there maybe an element of, I really love him as an author, it's kind of a popularity contest kind of thing? We can sometimes have some mixed motives that aren't
Right.
always right there. But I think the key thing is that if indeed Tolkien is amongst the saints, he's there, regardless of whether he has the formal title or not. And that's really the
Right.
important thing.
Right. Well, yeah, that's how I feel about it. What you just said, because I am leery of just let's canonize our favorite author. I feel kind of the same way about the Chesterton cause. I've read Tolkien's letters. I've read a lot about his life. My impression, he was a good man, a man I admire in many ways. My impression is not that he should be included in the public cult of the church, so to speak. I mean, canonization is not just a declaration that someone is in heaven. I mean, someone who made a deathbed conversion might do that. A deathbed conversion that, not a a martyrdom, a last minute martyrdom, that would be one thing. But just a regular old, plain old, I'm sorry, deathbed conversion shouldn't necessarily be held up as the sort of the highest level of example for all the faithful. And that's sort of how I feel about Tolkien. I know I've read his letters enough to feel like this is a guy I would love to be around. I find him admirable in many ways. I don't think that he necessarily should be canonized. You have a quote from his daughter Priscilla saying that, if you've read his letters, let alone the unpublished ones, you would want to come away thinking, well, this was a living saint. Heroic virtue across the board, sort of in a very consistent way, so that's sort of the impression that I have about it.
Yeah, and I think, it forces us to think about, what do we mean by saint? It's not just he won the popularity contest. And I think,
Right.
in 500 years' time, do I think he's going to be raised to the altar? I would say probably yes.
Hmm.
I think about Blessed Dominic Barbary. I think about St. John Henry Newman. I think if down in a couple of centuries, sure, probably, in God's good time.
Interesting.
Right now, I don't think it's the moment. And I don't think there's a need really. And as I said, I think
Sure.
it would confuse a lot of folks why do we need to confuse people unnecessarily?
Right. Okay. Interesting. Well, so that one reason I was asking about that is that let's say somebody believes Tolkien was a good guy, good Catholic, but not a saint. Why write a spiritual biography of someone? If it's not sort of specifically for that purpose.
Well, this is a great question, because it really gets to the heart of my project, which is that we don't need to share Tolkien's faith to find Tolkien's faith very important. And I think that is possibly the key insight of the book, because there are lots of Tolkien fans who are Catholics, but there are many more who are not. There are loads of Christians who are Protestants who love Tolkien, and there are millions upon millions of Tolkien fans who don't have the slightest, interest in Christianity at all, much less an adherence to it, and they love Tolkien. And so I think there's a bit of a chasm in a sense. People might love Tolkien, and yet think, well, what's this religious thing? What's this all about? I don't understand. I may be a little bit nervous about it. I think sometimes people who are not Christians can be a little touchy about considering Tolkien's faith, because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is because they're maybe afraid that if they look more deeply into it, Tolkien's going to turn out to be some sort of bigot who hates anybody who's not a Catholic. Anybody who's listening, who was worried about that, do not worry. He was not a bigot. He was big-hearted. He was very, very open-hearted and in his faith. But also, I think people can be worried that if they start to investigate his faith as something that's important to Tolkien, the author who's sharing it with them is going to then whack them over the head with it and begin to kind of try to evangelize them. And there's a place for evangelization. There's a place for sharing the faith, but that is not what people are looking for when they're trying just to learn about their favorite author. And I think that's an important missing piece with regard to Tolkien. Here is his faith that was so important to him. he emphasizes over and over how integral it is to his life, to his self-understanding, to his writings. So we can fairly say, as I say in the first chapter of my book, it was important to him, and therefore it should be important to us. Whatever our perspectives, whether we think it's great that he was a Catholic or regrettable that he was a Catholic, we should want to understand, what did that mean to him? What did he believe? How did he live it out? And you mentioned a little bit about context. As an English Catholic Christian of the early 20th century, he had a very different experience of the faith than even, Catholics in America. How are we to understand that? And so I really wanted to approach it from really a purely biographical standpoint. What did he believe? How did he live it out? And then people can go where they like with it.
So we know, many people know the basic outline of Tolkien's childhood insofar as he was born in South Africa. His mother took him and his brother on a trip to England when they were very small. His father dies in South Africa while they're in England. They never go back to South Africa. Later on, his mother converts to Catholicism. The boys become Catholic. She dies of diabetes. Then they are adopted by this Oratorian priest, Father Francis Morgan. Tolkien considers his mother to be something of a martyr because she had been basically disowned financially by most of her family upon becoming Catholic. And so what I want to get into, though, is a little bit more of the details of that experience and the context of England and what the actual, aside from being cut off financially and the suffering of that, what the actual dangers were for the children as Catholic orphans in England.
Right. Well, the first thing to realize is that England in the early 20th century, so Mabel became a Catholic in 1900, so right at the start of the new century, the culture was extremely anti-Catholic. Catholics were a very small minority. And we should remember, in the larger context, Catholicism in England after the Reformation had been made illegal. There were horrific penalties for even the basic practice of the Catholic faith during the penal times of Elizabeth especially. And although those draconian penalties, death for sheltering priests, for instance, those were eased off, the civil disabilities lasted for centuries. So Catholics couldn't, for instance, vote. They couldn't hold ordinary civil offices up until the mid 1800s. They were, for instance, excluded from the great universities in Oxford until 1854. If you wanted to matriculate to enter at Oxford, you had to affirm the 39 Articles, which is a specifically Anglican declaration of faith that specifically excludes Catholics and nonconformists and atheists and Jewish people, but is aimed really specifically at Catholics in his rejection of things like transubstantiation. And so Catholics could not go to the universities. This doesn't end until 1854. It isn't until 1871 that finally Catholics can be fellows, hold university positions. That's only 30 years before Mabel becomes a Catholic. And when there had been any sort of reprieve in returning civil rights to Catholics, there would be things like riots in the streets, literal riots, the Gordon riots, for instance, people, saying down with popery. So this is the context in which Mabel becomes a Catholic, in which there are still restrictions on Catholics in their civil rights. Some of them didn't get, ended until actually Tolkien's adult life. And the atmosphere, the environment was one in which the Anglican establishment was very much the establishment. So to be a Catholic was to be socially marginalized, typically poorer. It meant you were excluded from a lot of English culture and opportunities. Even the churches were cheap and ugly, because at the Reformation, the establishment took over all of the existing parish churches, and so Catholics had nowhere to worship. First, it was illegal, and then they just didn't have anywhere. So we have, for a Catholic of Mabel, she would be going from experiencing worship in potentially a very beautiful, old, um, elegant church to attending a crowded mass at some kind of cheap and nasty, brick brick building. Um, so it's very much a huge cultural shift for her. And I think that's important to emphasize because it really underscores that it was a move of conscience for Mabel. She wasn't just sort of shopping around for a nicer way of worship. She wasn't just sort of, oh, this sounds good, I'll try it. It came with a real cost. And so she became a Catholic out of evidently a deep personal conviction. And she held to it. And I think this is where Tolkien's understanding of her as a martyr really comes in. She held to that faith even when it cost her socially, familially, health wise, economically. It would have been so easy for her to revert back, and she didn't. And that I think is significant.
Right. Well, you also mentioned her sister, right? Who became Catholic for a minute and then was pulled back into the Anglican Church.
Yeah, I mean, it gives you a good case study because her sister May was actually received in the same month as her. They both received instruction together, and then within a week of each other, both May and Mabel were received into the Catholic Church. But her sister, her husband was alive, and he was extremely upset by his wife becoming a Catholic, and he simply forbade it. He said, "You are not ever to enter a Catholic church again." And she either accepted that or capitulated to that, depending on how you want to think about it. And that brings us to another aspect of the cost of it and the dangers of it, as you noted, because there were children involved. The courts were very biased in favor of the Protestant view of things. And so, for instance, if her sister's husband had decided to separate from her, in the current legal cultural situation, he could simply have taken her daughters and forbade her to see them, and she would never have seen her children again, and that would have been upheld. Now, Mabel, her husband, had died, still an Anglican. So what would happen when Mabel died, with her boys as Catholics? Well, a lot of times what happened is that the Protestant relatives would swoop in and even take families to court, even with living mothers, take the family to court to regain custody of the children so they could raise them as Protestants. So raising her sons in this faith, which she had accepted at such cost, was actually quite a challenge for Mabel because she was well aware that the extended family was very much against it, and they would have wanted the boys to be raised Protestant. And because their father had been an Anglican, they could easily have made a case in court. Oh, we're bringing the boys back to the faith of their father. Never mind the wishes of the mother, never mind the wishes of the boys themselves. We're going to take them back. And in fact, when Mabel died, there was a little bit of talk amongst the family of contesting the will and bringing the boys into a Protestant boarding school. So all of this brings us to a key factor in Mabel's decision making, which I think has been a bit overlooked. We know that eventually she ends up at the Birmingham Oratory, and that Father Francis Morgan, a priest of the Oratory, becomes the boy's guardian. He's the executor of Mabel's will. Well, how did she end up at the Oratory? She goes to a couple of different churches first, finally ends up there. Why the Oratory? The Oratory at that time was not particularly impressive in terms of the building. It was a dingy, shabby little building at the time. If she'd wanted something closer to her Anglican, architectural beauties of worship, she could have gone to St. Chad's Cathedral, which was a newish cathedral in Birmingham, very beautiful. She goes to the Oratory instead, and I think it's precisely because it's the Oratorians, brought to Birmingham by John Henry Newman, and I think the Newman influence through the Oxford movement was a big part of why Mabel became a Catholic to begin with. And most significantly, the Oratorian fathers at that time were nearly all converts, and they understood the landscape. They understood being a Protestant. They weren't afraid of it or contemptuous. They knew what it was like to make that change. And also, the Birmingham Oratorians had special insight into helping convert women. And they had even protected some families, during court proceedings when Protestant, extended family tried to take the children away. So by bringing her family to the Birmingham Oratory, Mabel was coming to a place where she and the boys could get instructed by priests who actually understood their background, so they would know what they did and didn't know about the Catholic faith, coming from the Anglican background, and who would help ensure that the boys would be raised up Catholic, which they did.
Great. Yeah. And we'll talk a bit more about the oratory in a minute. I wanted to ask, what age was Tolkien when he actually became Catholic?
Well, it depends slightly what you mean by became. He himself dates his exposure to the faith to when he was 8. That's when his mother became a Catholic. But he wasn't formally recognized as a Catholic in his own right until his first Holy Communion, and confirmation, which took place just before his 12th birthday.
Okay.
Because at age 8, he was past the age of reason. And so he wasn't considered to be kind of grandfathered in, as it were, with his mother. He was old enough that he would need to make the decision for his own. And so he entered into the experience of the faith at age 8. And then at age 11, he made his own formal procession and was received into the church in his own right at his first Holy Communion, which is later than it is usually today. So he had his first Holy Communion and his confirmation together when he was 11, just about to be 12.
And she died when he was 12?
Yeah, so later in the same year. So later, well, he became a Catholic at the end. He was confirmed at the end of 1903. He turns 12 in 1904, January, and then she dies in November of 1904.
Okay, so before we get to the oratory then, one more thing about Tolkien's family. You mentioned in the book that he actually does end up having relationships with his relatives, even ones who had sort of not done anything to help his mother when he was younger.
Yes, and this is remarkable, and it's so often taken for granted because we see that the family is very hostile to Mabel becoming a Catholic. And then, on her deathbed, her sister May comes. None of the other family comes. Her own parents don't come to see her when she's dying. It's a bit shocking, but this is in line with the hard line that Protestants would take. In a sense, they were taking it very seriously. And, well, maybe this is how she'll finally come back to the fold. If we're just not going to go to her. It might be a tacit affirmation of this Catholic thing. So she's during her life, her family is very hostile to her faith. But then we go forward into, Tolkien's boyhood, and he's going on family trips. He's spending time with his cousins. What happened? And we have to look at Father Francis Morgan. And there's a line in one of Tolkien's letters where he says that Father Francis first taught him charity and forgiveness. And I think that unlocks a lot of that relationship. Because Father Francis, as the ward of the two boys, he could easily have just isolated them from the extended family. That would have been kind of the easier thing to do. But he was a very big-hearted man, and I think he knew his orphaned wards needed their family. It was harder to make those connections and still preserve their Catholic faith, but it was worth doing. And so he must have reached out. He did reach out. We know some instances in which he reached out to the family to make those connections. And he evidently helps the boys to rebuild those relationships while still building up their Catholic faith. And so that must have included learning charity towards his relatives who didn't share his beliefs and maybe were dismissive or sometimes contemptuous of them. It meant forgiving them for whatever he might have held against them for not supporting his mother. I think there's a sort of a little pastoral miracle going on here, with Father Francis nurturing this sense of forgiveness, and allowing him to have these relationships that end up being important to
Right.
him.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have to mention that this summer I went to the UK and I went to Birmingham and wasn't really expecting. I mean, of course, I knew Tolkien had been there, and I actually went to Moseley Bog, which is apparently a place that he liked to explore, and I went to the Sarehole Mill. But I also the main reason I went to Birmingham was to go to the Oratory and the Newman Museum there as a sort of a pilgrimage. But I did, among other things, get to visit St. John Henry Newman's library in the oratory, which was amazing. But also in that library, they do, in a desk there, under the desk, they keep the trunk that Mabel took with her from South Africa to England. And in the desk, they keep some things, mostly some books and cards and pamphlets that belong to the young Tolkien brothers and to Mabel, such as a book of meditations by Savonarola that Mabel owned, and a school book, I think a book on Shakespeare that Tolkien had used in high school at King Edward's. And so I got to actually handle some of these books that belong to the Tolkiens, which was quite amazing. People know about Tolkien being raised by this Oratorian priest. They know about the story about him being forbidden to see Edith for a certain number of years until he became a major, if that's the expression, until he stopped being a minor, and then them getting married. So people know about Father Francis, but one of my favorite things about this book is that you bring out the more general Oratorian influence on Tolkien, and you even profile several priests who were at the Oratory and Tolkien would have been likely to encounter during this time. So not to necessarily get into all the individuals, but just to talk generally about what the Oratory is like, what its spirituality is, and how that would have influenced Tolkien.
Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the biggest discoveries, in a sense, from my research on Tolkien, looking at his context. Because, yeah, as you said, everybody knows about Father Francis, if they know anything about Tolkien's biography, but they tend to think of him as just an isolated priest, and maybe, the Birmingham Oratory, well, that's his church. Right. But the Birmingham Oratory was a whole community, 15 to 20 fathers there at any given time. And he's part of this community, a very active part of it. And that's something that shaped him. And he became friends. I mean, for instance, Father Vincent Reed, who's one of the other Oratorian fathers, became a lifelong friend and visited him as an adult. And so we see there's lots of other relationships that he forms. And one of the aspects of those individual relationships is that he had a lot of mentors. These are men who were well educated. Many of them had gone to Oxford and Cambridge as Anglicans, because they couldn't have at that point in their lives as Catholics. They were people who wrote books, who did scholarship. And this meant that he was raised up in an environment that really valued the intellectual life. And that's not a coincidence, because it connects to Oratorian spirituality. So it's the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, founded in Rome in the 16th century by Philip Neri, and brought to Birmingham by John Henry Newman. When Newman, he'd become a Catholic, he'd become ordained as a priest, and his friends with him, he thought, well, I want to found a community in Birmingham or in England. What community shall I found? Which one shall it be? And he chooses the congregation of the Oratory as being best suited to his gifts and his friends' gifts. And part of it is indeed that the Oratory, their charism, emphasizes the intellectual life. It encourages the fathers to continue in their independent, reading and work. It's a congregation, not an order. So remember, the fathers are free to leave at any time. It's a fellowship. It's a voluntary association bound by ties of love and community, rather than by an order. And St. Philip then is the Holy Father of the Oratorian community, and his spirituality, it's very Eucharistic. That's a key figure. And it also has a couple of really important characteristics. One of them is an emphasis on humility. He's very keen to emphasize humility as a fundamental virtue of the Christian life. And that's it's interesting, because he's pairing it with an encouragement of the intellectual life and
Mm,
also an encouragement of artistic gifts. Because another aspect of Oratorian spirituality is a great emphasis on the arts. Music, that's a huge part of Oratorian spirituality. Beauty in the liturgy, beauty in the vestments. So, intellectual life, beauty, art, music, but also humility, so that you don't make those things an end in
right.
themselves. And woven all through that is also humor. Philip was quite a character. There's loads of stories about how he would use humor to sort of puncture people's, puffed up egos, and deflate his own ego, and using humor as a way to develop humility. Taking the spiritual life seriously by not taking himself too
Right.
seriously. And that is a key factor in Oratorian spirituality. And when I realized that, it unlocked a lot about Tolkien's own personality and his approach to life. Because Tolkien can be quite silly, and sometimes in ways that are a bit unexpected when you think, but he's a serious academic, he's a famous author, and yet he would have these like strange, silly shenanigans. But then if you realize he had been brought up to recognize humor as a way to keep himself humble, it begins to make a lot more sense.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's great to know more about the oratory in the context of this book, and I think you dedicated the book to the fathers of the Birmingham and the Oxford oratories, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, it's cool and unexpected in a way to get so much about Newman, so much about Saint Philip Neri in a biography of Tolkien. I think that will be good for the people reading it. Speaking of Saint Philip Neri, certainly brought forth to general attention for the first time in this book is Tolkien's unknown initial, J.R.P.R. Tolkien. So what is this hidden P that nobody knows about?
Well, it's quite interesting because Tolkien took the name Philip at his confirmation, and this had been known in Tolkien scholarship, but not properly recognized or understood. Because, well, what does this mean? You have to know what a confirmation name means to understand the significance. So he takes Philip, but which Philip, right? That was not known. However, I was able to ask the late Priscilla Tolkien a little bit before she died. I asked her directly, this Philip that your father took as his confirmation name, was it St. Philip Neri? And she said, yes,
Hmm.
it was St. Philip Neri. And that confirmed, I already suspected this, but she confirmed it. And so he takes his name in his confirmation, and then it becomes increasingly important to him as he matures in his life. And in the 1930s, there's a list, he's making a list of his family's names, all first, middle names, in Elvish script, as one does if one is Tolkien. And he gives his own name as John Ronald Philip Reuel Tolkien. So we can see that he considers this to be part of his name. And it also makes sense of an otherwise quite puzzling reference in his lecture on English and Welsh, where he says his surname is German, and he mentions his four given names, and wait, four? You have to count Philip. So it turns out that the names are John, is his name from Hebrew. Ronald is his name from the Norse. Philip is from Greek, and Reuel is that it actually comes from French, although the name is a Hebrew name and is in the Old
Hmm.
Testament. So those are his four names. So he's really considering Philip to be important to him. And so I was not the one who discovered the hidden P. It was my friend and colleague Michael Ward, who looked at the monogram and said, there's a P in it. What? And if you look at the monogram, and you can find it online lots of places, it's got a little spur on the side of the T upright. What is this spur doing? What does it belong to? It's asymmetrical. It doesn't fit to anything. But if you realize that he considered that he had a fourth name, you can trace the loop of the P and the R, and then that little asymmetrical spur,
Hmm.
well, could it be indicating the foot of the P? That's what Michael pointed out to me, and then I think he's right.
I'd like to ask, well, I'm going to jump forward a little bit, actually. One thing that I There's a bit in this book about Tolkien's reaction to C.S. Lewis's marriage to a woman who had been divorced. But there's another thing that I really had wanted to know how Tolkien reacted to, which isn't mentioned in the book, namely the divorce and remarriage of his son Christopher, which happened towards the end of his life. Now, is this not in there because we just is the knowledge just simply not available to us about how Tolkien responded to this or what he thought about it?
There's a little out there, but primarily the reason that I don't discuss it in the book is something I say right in the first chapter, that this book is a biography of Tolkien. And so it's not directly concerned with the lives of his wife or his children, except insofar as it affects Tolkien's own life and spirituality.
Right.
And so we know we know plenty about what Tolkien felt about divorce and remarriage from what he's talking about with Lewis and Joy, with sources that are perfectly public and available. I just felt it's not really suitable or necessary to go into the lives further than was necessary, and I didn't think it was necessary.
I see. Okay. I wanted to ask just a little bit about his experience in World War One. And the first thing I wanted to ask about is just as relates to his devotion to Mary. And there's a little bit in the book about his devotion to Mary in the context of the war and the way that he kind of framed Mary, that it actually can be related to the Lord of the Rings.
Right. So obviously the First World War, the Great War, was tremendously influential on Tolkien. And I certainly hope that readers would turn to John Garth's magnificent book, Tolkien and the Great War, for the sort of larger context of that. And looking at his spiritual experience in the war, which is what I was zeroing in on in these chapters. One of the most interesting things is that he comes through with his faith intact. And again, we mustn't take this for granted. It's very easy to take things for granted because that's how they happened. But, for instance, his friend C.S. Lewis went into the war as an atheist and came out as an atheist. Lewis's conversion to Christianity, came later. There were others, many Anglicans went into the war with, some level of faith and found that totally destroyed, coming out, rejecting their faith entirely. So we shouldn't take it as a given that Tolkien gets through the war with his faith intact, as in fact he does. And part of that, I think, we can usefully trace to his suffering as a boy, because he was an orphan by age 12, and he had to come to grips with that. And I think, again, we can trace the pastoral care of Father Francis and the other Oratorian fathers in helping him to process that, in helping him come to grips with the reality of suffering. And evidently he did. And one of the interesting things I looked at in researching this was actually some contemporary studies by Anglican chaplains and Catholic chaplains about the experiences of the soldiers in the war.
Yeah, this was fascinating.
Yeah, it was really neat because I was able to get the voices from 1919, from the men who were there, not projecting our attitudes backwards, but what did they say? Fascinating. And so Tolkien was actually quite ordinary in one sense, in that Catholics of that day, the soldiers, came into it with a faith that was pretty well instructed in terms of coming to grips with evil and suffering. That was something that was generally communicated in Catholic teaching and preaching at the time. And so how then do we see Tolkien's own, personal engagement with living out his faith in the trenches? One of them is he does seem to have made an effort to receive communion and go to Mass as and when he could. So we see that Eucharistic devotion continuing. But we also see him, memorizing prayers. We don't know that it dates specifically from the war, but later on he does talk about, he has these memorized prayers. He does say that he memorized the whole canon of the Mass, and that he found that quite useful when he, in difficult circumstances when he couldn't attend mass. And I am considering he's advising his son during the Second World War. He is surely thinking back to the First World War.
So.
And so he's also memorizing Marian prayers. So we see this as a way that he's bringing these prayers to mind, even when he's in the trenches or he's in the midst of this situation. One of the things he does too is he writes a poem, which is about Mary, and he gives it two titles. One is Consolatrix Afflictorum, and the other is Stella Vespertina. And Consolatrix Afflictorum is a title from the Litany of Loretto, Consoler of the Afflicted. And at first glance, one might assume that Stella Vespertina is as well, but it's not. It's actually Tolkien's sort of adaptation of the Litany of Loretto's title, Stella Matutina. So he takes, the classic title of Mary as Morning Star and makes her Evening Star. And this is too much to go into here, but it ties into his wartime experience in some quite specific ways. And then we end up seeing it in The Lord of the Rings as Arwen being described as the Evening Star.
Right.
So this evening,
and compared with Galadriel, who is the morning. Right?
Exactly. So we have then an example of the way that, for instance, Tolkien's use of Catholic imagery is subtle and nuanced. Marian imagery. It's very easy to look at Galadriel and say, oh, here's a Marian figure. Well, yes, she is. But she's not the only Marian figure. We see then Arwen as another Marian figure, but they're different. Mary as Morning Star, Mary as Evening Star. So I think attending to details like this helps us get a more nuanced sense of the way that Tolkien is bringing in his Catholic faith into his work. I really hope people reading this book will see that he was a lot more subtle and understated than sometimes we might think.
Well, and I don't know the exact quote, but when he says to somebody at some point that what is noble and beauty in his work, he believes he owes to the Blessed Virgin Mary. That this gives us a more specific or a more general idea of that beyond just the figure of Galadriel is typically who people point to.
Exactly. So, for instance, the Hobbits. I was quite taken aback by realizing it's right there in the letters, but he connects the Hobbits to the virtue of humility. He writes that the Lord of the Rings was designed to be hobbitocentric, and he explicitly says that it's a study of the ennoblement or sanctification of the humble. Right. And of course, that's an allusion to the Magnificat.
Yes, totally.
And so he's connecting Mary and her humility, her, the sort of iconic humility of Mary, to the Hobbits. So the Hobbits, so Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, they are also Marian figures. Again, we can see that this is much more nuanced and interwoven little threads, not just, boom, here's a Marian figure.
A little bit later, Tolkien, we were talking about Tolkien's devotion to his faith during the war. A little bit later, under seemingly less trying circumstances, he speaks later in a late letter to his son, and saying there was a time when they were young children that he almost ceased to practice his religion. And of course, I've always wondered what that meant. On further reflection about it, of course, that can mean many things. For example, the daily rosary is an extremely important part of my religious practice on a day-to-day basis as a way of maintaining my spiritual life. If I were to stop, God forbid, saying the daily rosary, I might say, and come back to it later, I might say in recent years, I almost ceased to practice my religion, even if I had kept going to Mass every Sunday. If I stopped going to daily Mass and stopped saying the rosary, for me, it would be tantamount to almost stopping practicing my religion. So we have to take that not with a grain of salt, but in relative terms, right?
Right. So we don't know at this point, and we may know more later as more letters are published, but we don't know specifically. We do know whatever it wasn't a complete cessation of his faith, because as you noted, the quote is, I almost ceased to practice my religion. But I do think that whatever it was, Tolkien felt it was a serious issue. because it's
Right.
quite a
Because he
serious.
felt that he had failed his children in properly inculcating the faith in them, at least at a young age.
He did. Yeah, that was one of the areas that he felt that he should have done better. But he also describes this time, and we don't know exactly how long it was, but he marks it by location. He says in Leeds, and then and to the first place that they lived in Oxford and 22 Northmore Road. And that frames out a 10-year span. Now, was he referring to the whole 10 years? We don't know. It could have been just a part of it. But the way that he frames it suggests that it was a number of years, at any rate. And he talks about during this time that he felt a starving hunger towards Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. And so, and the fact that he speaks of it quite seriously, there's none of the hyperbole that he sometimes uses when he's taking something a little more lightly. And the fact that he refers to it in these terms of failing to live up to his love of God. I suspect that his mass going probably became less regular. His confession going probably became less regular. His prayer life probably became less regular, less consistent. And I suspect that he felt a kind of barrenness or aridness in his spiritual life. These are not things that we can pin down for certain, but they're consistent with what he's talking about, especially because he also talks about, being tempted to sloth, which in Catholic terms is a specific vice, the sort of listlessness in the spiritual life. And we do know that when he was, an undergraduate, he went through a time in which he didn't make it to Mass consistently. So, and we also want to put this in the context of the fact that he's just come out of his wartime service. He was, in the war, and now he's demobilized. He's a war veteran. He's trying to get back to civilian life. And one of the things that one of the chaplains in this first-hand study of the Great War soldiers commented, one of the chaplains, the Catholic chaplain, said that he worried that some of the men might have a difficult time adjusting to civilian practice of the faith, because when they were soldiers, they were given dispensations for all sorts of things. They didn't have to fast before receiving communion. They didn't have the Sunday obligation for Mass. They couldn't, because they were out there in trenches, and it was a totally different scenario. Now they're back in civilian life. There's quite a rigorous Eucharistic fast. There's the Sunday obligation is back again. And a lot of soldiers had a hard time getting back into that routine after having it so totally disrupted in the war.
Sure. And if you're someone who thrives under pressure, maybe you're someone who clings to God more closely in a difficult situation, then you're suddenly put into a situation where that pressure is gone and you might struggle to find your footing.
Yeah, and he's got a whole different set of challenges because he's had a very kind of intense life up until now. And now his life becomes, in a sense, more ordinary. He has a wife, finally is able to actually live in one place with her. They have a young family. He has a good job. But that in itself is its own spiritual challenge. How do you get used to ordinary life and the ordinary practice of the faith? And I suspect that he just had a hard time with it. And this is, in a way, one of the ways that I find him, it makes him easier to relate to, knowing that he went through this stretch of just having a hard time figuring out how to live out his faith. He didn't have a handle on it for a while, for quite a long while. He eventually gets back into the groove, but I think it kind of humanizes him in a sense.
Is there any connection here to his wife Edith became Catholic basically in order to marry him? Not that she wasn't sincere in her conversion, but sorry, let me rephrase that she became Catholic. Their marriage precipitated her conversion in some way. Is it fair to say that?
Yes, it is. And that's actually, I'm glad that you kind of rephrased it, because that's a very interesting point that I turned up in my research, which totally surprised me, which was Edith did not have to become Catholic to marry Tolkien. It was not necessary. And that was...
But he really wanted her to.
He did. He really wanted her to, but that's not the same thing. Because I had always assumed that she had to become a Catholic if they
Okay.
were going to marry.
At this
Um,
time, yeah.
and then I realized, I went absolutely down the deepest dive possible. I even consulted a canon lawyer to make sure I was understanding the documents correctly, looked at pre-1917 canon law in England.
Hmm.
I went down the absolute, you know, rabbit hole to find all the documents. We have to consider that Catholics in England in the early 1900s, absolutely a minority. So marriages in which one Catholic wanted to marry a Protestant, that was a pretty common situation given the cultural context.
Hmm.
Um, Now, the church didn't encourage these. In fact, they discouraged them
Hmm.
because, again, because of the cultural context, because there was a lot of anti-Catholicism. If a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, is the Catholic going to be drawn away from the church? And what's going to
Yeah.
happen to the children? So there was a discouragement, but also a realism like, okay, for a lot of couples, they're going to still want to do this. What next? So there was a whole process in place. All they had to do was get a dispensation. At this point, they could go to the local bishop. It used to be they had to go all the way to the Pope. In fact, Father Francis's parents, his father had been a Protestant and his mother a Catholic, and they got their dispensation from the Pope to marry. So Tolkien would have known about this kind of thing. One of his
Right.
one of their fathers there was a canon lawyer, so he would have had to get his dispensation. The non-Catholic would have had to promise to allow the Catholic to practice his faith freely, which Edith would certainly have agreed to. She was favorably inclined, and they would have had to agree to raise the children as Catholics. And again, Edith was favorably disposed towards Catholicism.
Right.
So she and Tolkien could have gotten married in a mixed marriage if she had wanted to do that. And I think so. There's 2 points here that are important. One is that the reason Tolkien wanted her to become a Catholic was because he loved her and wanted her to enjoy what he also had. It
Yeah.
wasn't just about, I want to marry
Right.
you,
Right.
but
Right. Right.
also that Edith, and she ended up not having a great experience as a Catholic, but her decision was freely taken because
Right.
she could have said, no, I'll marry you, but we're going to have to get the dispensation. She could have, and she was a pretty strong woman, I think. I
Yeah.
think she would have, if she had felt that way. So again, a free decision on either's part.
But the reason I bring this up is that we know that she did later on, not necessarily permanently, but for at least for a period of time, she did sort of cool towards a really active practice of the faith. And so I had wondered if Tolkien's period of sloth may have coincided with that tension between them on account of that.
Yeah, I would have to look again more closely at the dates. I think
Yeah.
it does overlap at least to a certain amount. And I
Mhm.
think, to be accurate, it was more than just a cooling. She actually became quite hostile for a number of years, and
Right.
she objected to Tolkien taking the children to church. So there was a lot of tension that came
It
up.
was that bad. Okay,
It
I
was
didn't
that bad.
realize that. Yeah.
So it was a rocky stretch in their
Yeah.
relationship. And again, I think this ultimately speaks well of their relationship, that they get through it.
Yeah.
And she never became
Yeah.
as enthusiastic as Tolkien, but she did return to the
Yeah.
practice of her faith, and was died a Catholic.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I just think, yeah, she Tolkien clearly had some sway over her. I mean, given the fact that she was engaged when he was finally able to make contact with him, and then dropped her fiance at his request. And so I can see, even though her choice to become Catholic was clear, I can see it certainly having been one that was influenced by the intensity of his passion and his whatever kind of influence that he had over her love for him, and then that later on, when she sort of when the challenge would have been to come into it more on in her own right, then that she came to that crossroads, and then perhaps became a little bit resentful
Yeah,
for a period of time.
and I think,
And then
and
that may have influenced him as well, as somebody who of course was very passionately in love with her.
yeah, I mean,
So
it certainly a challenge for him later on, but also, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, he certainly did. He did strongly encouraged her to become a Catholic. Indeed, he pressured her.
Yeah.
And this is, it was her free choice. But he really wanted her to make that choice. And it's
Yeah.
interesting, in looking at Tolkien's life, I'm willing to say, and I do say in the book that, he was overzealous. He's a bit tactless, really, at a few points in how he speaks
Right.
about the Anglican establishment. And this is a faith that had nourished Edith. And yeah, he was making some legitimate points, but he was making them in ways that were not necessarily very tactful or sensitive
Right.
to Edith, and not really thinking through what her experience was. And I think that Tolkien learned from this, because
Sure.
if we look at his later interactions with some of his non-Catholic friends, when he's in his 40s and his 50s, there's a sensitivity there
Sure.
that we don't see when he's a teenager, right? In his early 20s. And I
I
think
think
that's a
many of us can
natural.
relate to this. Yeah.
Yeah. But again, I think that's a sort of a natural, sort of human growth. He was so in love with Edith, and he wanted her to share this beautiful thing that he had. He got a bit over enthusiastic and probably wasn't very helpful in that regard. And he learned from it, and learned that sometimes the more loving thing to do is to back off a little bit and be a bit more gentle. And we see that in some of his friendships later
Sure.
on.
It's interesting for me to reflect on their marriage because, people very, very much romanticize Tolkien and Edith, the Baron and Luthien thing, and of course, he did too. Although he did come to this realization, right, that men and women are women are companions in shipwreck, not guiding stars, as he wrote in a famous letter to, was it Michael
Mhm.
that he was writing to there? Yeah. Um, but yeah, no, it's interesting, because wow, he waited and then came back and talked to her when he could. And I don't know, I think that the tensions that happened later for me, I feel like the wisdom of the church in discouraging mixed marriages is very much confirmed. Of course, this wasn't a mixed marriage, but in the same way, even more so for mixed marriages, obviously, for actual mixed marriages. So it's just interesting to reflect on, the romantic feelings of it are not the whole story. Sometimes there's like a certain prudence and a certain sort of like just sobriety that you have to view these things through as well.
Well, even, I
Just
mean, just
finding a
the,
suitable spouse, even though God's providence can do all sorts of things with whatever choices you make.
and of course, his experience in being married to Edith, any relation. I mean, they were married for 55 years,
Yeah.
until she died. Any relationship, any friendship, let alone a marriage that lasts that long, is inevitably going to have tensions. And I think Tolkien's just wisdom is so refreshing. When he's writing to Michael, he's speaking as a man to a man, talking about male weaknesses and the fact that, men, he says we could easily, have all sorts of children, and enjoy the process. But he says, but we have to, be disciplined. We have to accept the truth of revelation. We are married to one woman. And he talks about the way that he says your soulmate is the one you're actually married to.
Mhm.
That you're going to have a point where you're thinking, well, what if and what if, but no. Who is your soulmate? Well, whatever it might seem like, is actually the one that you are married to. And
Mhm.
that sort of groundedness to say, yep, this is my spouse. Here we go. We're going to get through this. That groundedness comes from, I think, loving Edith absolutely deeply. He's brokenhearted when she dies. He loved her greatly, but he also recognized that yeah, she was a companion in shipwreck. They were doing this together. She wasn't some, goddess on a pedestal. She wasn't perfect. He wasn't perfect. They were two fallen people trying to help each other, get to heaven. And that kind of practical acknowledgement and, okay, we're just going to have to get on with it, is, I think, kind of heartening.
Right. Right. Um, so Tolkien takes up the practice of his faith with increased zeal as time goes on, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about him being a Catholic at Oxford and how he manifested his faith in his professional setting over the years.
Well, this was, again, another thing that sort of surprised me when I started digging into the context, because First of all, there were very few Catholics at Oxford. I discovered that, when Tolkien arrived to pick up his first professorship, the Rawlinson Bosworth Professorship of the Chair of Anglo-Saxon, there were only 3 other Catholic professors, a professor being someone who has a named chair, and there were only a handful of people who were teaching at Oxford who were Catholics. There's very few of them. And amongst these 4 Catholics, Tolkien and his 3 colleagues, each of them was the first Catholic to hold the chair since the Reformation. So there's really a sense of being, okay, we are the minority in this academic world, as well as the cultural world. It would have been very easy for Tolkien to absolutely compartmentalize his faith and say, okay, well, I'm going to, I'll go over to St. Gregory's on Sundays and worship in my parish church, but that's it. I'm not going to put not going to show myself as a Catholic. But in fact, he was very visible as a Catholic academic. He was involved with various organizations. He turned up at major events. He was a mentor to young Catholics. He's very visible, and that is something that has not, I think, been noted sufficiently. Now, you have to get into the primary source documents that trace this, but when you go and look at newspaper accounts, here's Tolkien again showing up and doing things. He's involved. He's there. He's present.
Right. Yeah. Now, there's a great little book by an American author, Clyde Kilby, called Tolkien and the Silmarillion, which you cited in this book, and I sort of reminded me I had read it a few years ago. Now, the book's a little outdated because it was published before the Silmarillion was finally published in its what we know as its finished form by Christopher Tolkien. But a good chunk of the book is Kilby just describing the day-to-day and spending time with Tolkien as an assistant. And it's really the best document that I've seen of just what it was like to hang out with Tolkien sort of on a daily basis. And it certainly reveals some of his personality flaws as well as what was delightful about him. But the line that you quoted that I wanted to bring up is, Clyde Kilby said, "He told me that he had many times been given a story as an answer to prayer." Now, this whole topic of inspiration is something that I'm very interested in studying as with regards to the arts, and Tolkien does refer in his letters and elsewhere to an increasing awareness of not having just come up with these stories on his own. So I just wanted to ask you to talk about that because that's very important for Catholic artists to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. And of course, I would like to know, well, which stories, but we don't know. We don't know which ones were specifically answers to prayer. But I think that helps us in a way unlock this sense of other comments that Tolkien makes about feeling that he's kind of the custodian of these stories, that he's not really the inventor, but the discoverer of them. And taken in one angle, we can see that as, him kind of being really integrated in his imagination with Middle Earth, and this legendarium has become kind of part of him. But we can't separate that from his faith. So how is it that these stories are being given to him? Well, he doesn't need to spell it out. If you know what he believes, you can see, okay, well, part of this givenness is then his perception that it's through the work of the Holy Spirit that he's being given these stories.
Right.
And, again, the kind of ordinariness of it is important because, Tolkien did occasionally have visions. He has quite a striking vision of, or apperception, he calls it, of God when he's praying in front of the Blessed Sacrament one time. But as a day-to-day experience, his faith is kind of, is not full of dramatic moments. So a story coming as an answer to prayer is not going to come with a neat, bow on top of it. It's going to sort of emerge out of his creative process. And I think we see some of this in his articulation of his idea of subcreation. And we see this in his great essay on fairy stories, where he says, "We make in our measure and our derivative mode because we are made, and made in the image and likeness of a maker." So it's God as the creator has stamped his image, his creative image, on each of us. And so Tolkien as a writer is then expressing that image of God by being a creator in a subsidiary sense.
Yeah, there's also a great little line in there about Christ being the only just literary critic. I forget where that was from, but
Yeah, Tolkien actually paraphrases a letter by Gerard Manley Hopkins,
mm,
in which Hopkins is talking about the only just judge of literature is Christ. Only God can know the whole story, and I think that Tolkien found that particularly important as somebody who, well, first of all, who knew people, his friends, who had died before they had a chance to tell their stories. And of course, he had more stories than he could possibly tell in his lifetime, as he expresses in his story Leaf by Nigel.
okay. Here's a completely different topic. Was Tolkien a trad? And I specifically want to ask about liturgical change because the famous story that people tell that I think comes from, is it his grandson Simon who tells this story, is about him uh, continuing to say the mass responses very loudly in Latin and sort of stomping his feet along with it or something. Well, after the mass had been translated into English, and I just wanted to ask. We don't have to get into all the details and the whole timeline of everything, but how much is that warranted that people like to claim him as a trad, and we can talk about it specifically in the liturgical sphere.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question because it's quite a lot more complex than I thought before I started researching this book. And I've got a
Hmm.
couple of chapters that deal specifically with that. So, was he traditionalist? Well, in the sense that he appreciated the tradition of the church, that he would not have favored change for change's sake. Okay, he was a traditionalist.
Hmm.
Was he a traditionalist in the way that I know that you cast it, a trad, rejecting Vatican II and favoring, the absolutely favoring the pre-Vatican II liturgy? No, he was not. And I think there's a couple really key points there. One is that I'm sure most people who are familiar with this question are aware of the so-called Agatha Christie indult, the
Hmm.
request to retain the practice of the Latin Mass. And Tolkien did not, he was not one of the signatories. Many people assumed he was. He was not. Several of his Inklings friends were, and he was not. Now, we can't make too much of an argument from silence, but the fact that some of his Inklings friends signed it, they would have known where to find him. They would have
Yeah.
been able to reach him. He never made any public comment about the changes in the liturgy. Never did he make a public comment about it. He complained
Yeah.
privately to his friends and his family, but he never made a public comment, unlike, say, Yves Lenoir, who very prominently and publicly expressed his displeasure. And we should know that Tolkien was perfectly willing to write letters to the editor on, of newspapers if he had something to say. There are other
Right.
letters that he writes.
Right.
He maintains silence on this matter. And so those give, and here's another point too. Well, at the end of his life, he's choosing to go to St. Anthony of Padua, a very ordinary Novus Ordo parish, even though there were other choices that he could have attended, or he could have pleaded his age and infirmity and had communion brought to him.
And he was a lector in the Novus Ordo as well.
Exactly, and that's the last point that I turned up the very interesting fact that in the 1960s, after the Novus Ordo, when laymen were then allowed to read scripture readings during Mass, which was new, Tolkien was a reader at the Corpus Christi Headington, so
Right.
he was willing to participate publicly, not just show
Right.
up, but participate publicly in this. So we have a couple of points that show whatever else is going on, he's not fitting into this sort of trad mode. But I do want to return
Well,
to that question that you about the liturgy.
sure, sure. Well, I mean, I just wanted to mention that. I mean, that story that people quote from Simon about him saying that, to me, that was never a story that reflected particularly well on Tolkien. And I say that as someone who would be in sympathy with saying, well, perhaps the old mass was superior or any of that. I'm certainly, I think those are legitimate opinions to have, and I'm sympathetic in various ways that the language question. But I don't think that that would have been the best way to respond to it.
Well,
And maybe that was just one time. Maybe we're getting an exaggerated version of the story. I don't know, but I'm just saying it's nice to see these counterbalances to that narrative, because I don't think that way of responding to it, as the way people portray that story, it necessarily speaks well of him in that isolated moment at the very least. So I don't think that people should spread that around as that, though that makes him awesome necessarily.
Well, this is, I mean, but actually this story, that particular story is very useful and interesting, because it allowed me to unravel a lot of these threads. So first
Right.
of all, it's often there's often several different stories conflated. So there's Simon, both Simon, his grandson Simon, and his granddaughter Joanna report him saying the responses in Latin when the Mass is shifted to English. We're going to come back to that in a second. That's the other story, is one that Clyde Kilby reports that someone else observed Tolkien being apparently offended by the lack of genuflections in the Mass, and he stomps out doing some bows, and then he leaves. And that I cite that in the book as well. Now that story, that I don't think it does reflect terribly well on Tolkien, insofar as we know that it. But what actually was the story? What actually happened? We only have it at best third hand. We have Kilby, who's not a Catholic, reporting somebody else's observation, possibly firsthand, possibly secondhand. I've never been able to get independent corroboration of this particular incident.
Good, yeah.
Now, I do, however, think Tolkien had a temper. He sometimes could really blow his top. It was a fault. I think it is consistent with his character that he had one day that he just got really annoyed with what he observed, and he did in some way storm out. But it seems to have been an isolated incident, and it reflects more on his, losing his temper than anything else. Right. But let's return to that story, that well corroborated story of Simon, because both Simon and Joanna report that Tolkien was giving the responses in Latin. Joanna's totally unbothered by it. Simon's embarrassed. So we have two different perspectives. It's clearly a thing that he did pretty often. Well, I also go pretty regularly to the traditional Latin Mass. When I'm in Oxford, I usually go once a week, once every 2 weeks. Although I normally go, to the Novus Ordo or to the Ordinaria form. And it occurred to me that the Novus Ordo is so structurally different from the traditional Latin Mass that it's actually impossible to just give the responses in Latin. It's just not the same pattern. The responses are different, and they're in different places. And that prompted me to do quite a lot of research into the liturgical changes that Tolkien actually experienced. And this was a huge eye-opener. Because first of all, and then plotting Tolkien's reactions date-wise against what was actually happening.
Yeah.
And this was huge, because it didn't all happen at once. The Novus Ordo didn't come into effect until quite late in Tolkien's life, the last couple of years of his life. What he experienced at first was simply the shift of the liturgy from Latin into English, but it was the same exact liturgy. It was just in English. And I even went so far as to, through the priest scholar in England who was able to give me scans of the missals, the transitional missals that they were using. So with my own eyes, I saw the parallel text, the English and the Latin, and they did it in stages. It was first the first part of the Mass and then the whole of it. So if you look at Tolkien's very vehement objections to the changes in the liturgy and you peg them as to dates, he is talking about the change from Latin to English. He is not talking about the Novus Ordo.
We don't have any comments by him on the changes in the prayers themselves, although he may certainly have thought that they were less well composed than the old ones, or I mean, it's plausible, but we just don't have any such comments.
And those are later, right?
And were there issues with the translation? This initial translation to English, were there some problems there?
Yeah, it was a pretty bad translation.
In Alec Guinness's memoir, he complains about the translations and the Mass readings. I think he's talking about the
there are other
seems to be a consistent issue in this period of time, right? And I think that the English got a better translation earlier than we did. Is that right?
Hard to say.
Hard to say.
But certainly, I mean, we have to remember too. First of all, Tolkien was fluent in Latin. He knew Latin intimately as a living language. So he's sorry to lose it to begin with. He's
Right.
also a prose stylist of genius who knows the English language inside and out. And there were bilingual missals in England, and I've used them in the appendix to Tolkien's Faith, that have quite beautiful renditions of the liturgy in English. Well, for whatever reason, they didn't use those. And
Hmm.
the translations were these sort of by committee messes. And
Right.
so Tolkien, I think, quite naturally, artistically, aesthetically, is like, what the heck is this? Also, the translations of the mass readings, he was probably the one in a million people who actually could understand the readings in Latin,
Right.
unlike most everybody else in
Right.
the congregation. And when they started doing, for instance, the Psalms, they were using Ronald Knox's translation, and Tolkien particularly disliked Knox's translation of the
And to be
Bible.
fair, Ronald Knox's translation was not some new, new agey sounding thing. It was a pre-Vatican II
Exactly.
work.
But for what we see then is this is not a Vatican II issue. This is a language and beauty issue. Tolkien
Yeah.
is sad to see Latin go, and the English that replaces it is clunky. He doesn't like it. And also, I was recently talking with Father James Bradley, who's a canon lawyer, and he made a very interesting observation that when they shifted over from Latin to English, it also meant that they were saying more of the prayers out loud, and the priests were not used to that, and they were doing a bad job simply
Mm.
saying the Mass.
Mm.
So we have an aesthetic experience that is very unpleasant, and this is what
Right.
Tolkien's objecting to. And now let's go to that scene where he's with Simon or with Joanna.
Yeah.
He's in the context of a mass. It's the same liturgy as he's had his entire life since he was 8. He knows the responses by heart. He says them
Yeah.
naturally, and he says them naturally in Latin at the appropriate time, in the appropriate place, because partly I imagine because he's just used to it, partly because he's a little curmudgeonly, and this is his little kind of protest.
Yeah.
But it's
And
not.
he's not breaking any rules, really. I mean, I have a priest at my parish, which is a Novus Ordo parish, who says, I think rubrics are for priests, not for lay people. And yeah, so, there's actually no breaking of rules. Now, it might be distracting to people around you, I suppose. Anyway, I think it sheds a little bit more of a sympathetic light on that particular
Yeah,
story.
and also the fact that Simon recounts that he says it loudly, and I don't think that was deliberate, because I think Tolkien had a respect for the liturgy that he wouldn't have deliberately disrupted it, even if he was privately being.
Yeah,
But
I
at
think
that
so.
point, he was quite deaf, and people who are going deaf don't have a good sense of the volume of their voices. So
Yes.
I think he was unintentionally louder than he meant to be. So all of this puts the proper context for his objections to the shifts in the liturgy. There's a couple other points I think are worth noting. One is with regard to the 1950s change to the Holy Week liturgy, which dramatically changed the structure of those liturgies. They were still in Latin, but they
Hmm.
very significantly changed the timing and the structures. Evelyn Waugh just about blew his top with he hated it so much.
Hmm.
Tolkien actually said that he said although he personally was sad to see the familiar liturgies go, he thought it was the right move. That he thought he
Hmm.
approved of them as being more suitable to the lives of modern Christians. That's his phrasing. So we can see that he's able to make a distinction between his personal attachment and okay, this is going to make it more accessible to more people to worship. And that's a very
Sure.
nuanced take, I think.
Right.
And he
Right.
also did not have rose-colored glasses when it came to the pre-Vatican II liturgy. This something that drives me a bit nuts. There's a part in one of the letters that he advises to his son Michael that a good cure for sagging faith is to go to a badly done mass, which is counterintuitive. But I think the point here is that he's encouraging a focus on the objectivity of it. This is Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. Even if the priest is mumbling and gabbling and the congregation is badly mannered and badly dressed, this is unfortunately not infrequently quoted as Tolkien's objection to the Novus Ordo. It's nothing of the sort.
Really? I've never seen
I
that. That's a
have.
pretty dishonest excerpting,
I
I
have.
would say.
It's people who don't pay attention to the dates. And he's referring to the pre-Vatican II experience. When
Yes.
he talks
Yes.
about all the terrible priests he's known in his life, of which Father Francis is the shining exception, he's talking about men who were formed and doing their ministry in the pre-Vatican II era. He is well aware that, things were quite often, done very badly. Ronald Knox, I don't quote this in the book, but Ronald Knox at one point in one of his books comments that he wishes he could make his Sunday masses longer than 20 minutes, but people object. Sunday masses, 20 minutes.
Yeah, wow. That's crazy.
It is crazy, but it was unfortunately pretty typical. So Tolkien didn't have any rose-colored glasses about what a mess the pre-Vatican II liturgy often was. And he had his objections to the changes, but they were not what we might assume that they were. It was primarily about the language.
So Tolkien shouldn't be used in an ideological way in this context. And there's, for people who are interested, there's more in the book about his response to the council more generally, and it's a nuanced picture. So thank you for that. I think people will be quite interested to hear this part of the discussion. Do you want to just sort of give an overview of what you think Tolkien's Christian virtues were?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I would probably put humility as right up there, because that's something that he strove to achieve, and I think did achieve. If you think about his great fame after the Lord of the Rings became a hit, he still lives quite an ordinary life and relates to people in quite an ordinary way. He could easily have become puffed up as a great figure, and he doesn't. He enjoys the wealth that the Lord of the Rings brought in, but he wasn't ostentatious about it. When one little detail that I turned up is that, when his old age pension began to kick in, he was already provided well enough for now with his the royalties from Lord of the Rings. He gave away the money from his pension.
Wow.
He didn't need it. He didn't need to live an ostentatious life. He had enough. So there's a humility that is consistent. It's consistent throughout his whole life. And I think another virtue the other virtue I would really name as standing out is perseverance, because he kept on even when it was hard. And one of the fruits, we didn't talk about this, one of the fruits of that stretch of, when he didn't practice his religion fully, is he's able to reflect later on about the importance of the will, that you can choose to be faithful, that you can choose to pray, you can choose to love, even if you don't have pious feelings. And that's such a wise perspective. And you can only get that really through persevering through the dry stretches. And I think if I were to name a third, I think he really shows a gift for forgiveness. He's able to forgive others. He's able to forgive himself. Partially, at least, I think he had more trouble with that than he did with forgiving others. But he's certainly striving to live out these virtues. And I think just that sense of wanting to do it, of persevering, of knowing that he is a sinner in need of salvation, knowing that he is in need of God's grace, that gives him, I think, a receptivity to grace that's really admirable.
Great. All right, Holly. Well, thank you for writing this book. It's a real scholarly achievement, but also very readable. I think very accessible to people, and so thorough. I mean, so many elements, even outside of the directly spiritual, that it brings to light that I didn't know about, having read, multiple other books about him already. So,
well, thanks. It was a delight to write. It was a delight to research, and I hope that it brings. And I hope fundamentally that people will feel like they know Tolkien better, because I feel like I know him better, and I love him even more as a person. So I hope that people will read this and feel like they've got to know him better too.
But I also definitely feel like I know his context better. I mean, his friendships, not just the Inklings, his friendships that he made later in life, his professional context, being a Catholic in England, his experience of his mother, all of those things were opened up.
Excellent.
Well, I pray that this book finds wide readership among non-Catholic Tolkien fans in particular. I think that would be a very good thing for the the Tolkien community.
I hope so. And I hope, too, that this is a book that, for instance, Catholic Tolkien fans can feel at ease maybe giving as Christmas presents or gifts to their non-Catholic or non-Christian friends. Because
Yeah.
I take, as I said at the beginning, I take a strictly biographical perspective. I say, yes, I am a Catholic, but I'm not going to foist this on you. There's a glossary of terms in the back for to people to look up if they don't know what these words mean. So I hope it will be accessible and inviting to those folks who maybe would like to learn more about it, but haven't quite figured out how to get into it.
Yeah. And, the scholarship of it can't be denied. This is not one of those, make a quick buck writing a little book about Tolkien's Catholic influence on Tolkien's work. And, those books are out there. But this is certainly by people who are in this field. It's undeniable,
Yes, thank you. 1,052 endnotes. I counted at one point when I was proofreading.
All right, Holly, thanks again so much for coming back.
All right, thanks. My pleasure.
All right, everybody. Well, I think I will be doing another Tolkien episode before too long, because in November we are getting an expanded edition of his letters. I want to say 100, 150 new letters, something like that, are coming out that have never been published before. And so I think I will do something a little bit different for that. I'm thinking of doing just a solo episode by myself, maybe selecting some of the letters that I think are interesting or reveal something new interesting about Tolkien as a person or about his work, and sort of just talking and reflecting on those rather than doing an interview for that. I think that'll be a good exercise for me. I want to learn how to do more episodes by myself as well. So you can look forward to that probably in November or December. Everybody, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.